So first, what is data-based individualization? It is, well, so we're going to start with why, right? We know that validated intervention programs are not universally effective as much as we want them to be, right? And students with intensive needs often require 10 to 30 more practice than their peers to learn new information. So in the 1970s, it's hard to believe that DBI has been around for this long. The federal reforms were rapidly expanding special education services. So we had so many more students with special needs inside of our schools. So figuring out how to design and deliver intensive academic and behavioral interventions became really overwhelming, right? So this is when the University of Minnesota in 1977 first introduced the DBI process. So let's think really quickly before we go into DBI, what it is and what it is not, right? It is individualized based on student needs. It's more intense and different content and pedagogy than your Tier 1 curriculum. And built into it, it has more frequent and precise progress monitoring. So what it is not is a single approach for all students, some kind of a manual or blueprint. It's not any kind of a preset program. It's certainly not more of the same Tier 1 instruction or more of the same supplemental instruction, right? Which is sometimes a trap we've fallen into, I think, both in RTI, MTSS land, and also when implementing DBI. So in 2013, the National Center on Intensive Intervention actually developed this graphic to help explain what DBI is, right? And it's not a program, although Classworks as a program supports you implementing DBI, there are still pieces of this that extend outside of Classworks to really effectively implement it, because it's an evidence-based process for individualizing and intensifying interventions for students, right? It includes evidence-based interventions, assessment, meaning progress monitoring, and your data and strategies that you develop as you're working with students. So there are 5 steps to the DBI process. It starts with a validated intervention program. That could be standard protocol, that could be the problem-solving model. For you guys, it's Classworks, right? That's your validated intervention program that you're using with students. Next, it goes to progress monitoring. And it's really important to note that progress monitoring, as you can see, is its own green circle here. It's not the scores from the orange block or the intervention program. It's something separate, right? Then, if you've got students that are not responding, right, then we go down and we need to gather diagnostic data. This is really where DBI becomes a process and it starts to pull itself more information than what we're just getting inside of Classworks, right? And we're going to talk about that in a lot more detail in one of our sessions tomorrow as well. I also want to point out that if you're managing 25 students and you're doing validated intervention programs and you're progress monitoring them, if you're implementing with fidelity, really only 5 of those students should be, at most, should be the ones that aren't responding and that need this diagnostic data gathered, right? So then once you've gathered all that diagnostic data that says, why aren't they responding? What is our challenge? Then you're going to make an adaptation to that valid intervention for the student. And again, we'll talk about this more tomorrow, but that adaptation is going to be something pretty minor that you're trying to do, right? You're not going to change everything for that student because it is a valid intervention program. And then really important in DBI, you are going to continue progress monitoring, right? Because what you're hoping is I had 4 or 5 of my students out of 25 weren't responding. Now I'm making a change. Now, hopefully, we're going to see that they are responding and that progress monitoring will reflect that. So the first thing that we start with is a standardized instructional program with known evidence for addressing identified needs in students, right? And that's where you guys have Classworks, right? You know that the program is case endorsed. You know that it's proven effective with What Works Clearinghouse reviews studies that show that it has an impact on student learning, right? So you're confident with Classworks that we do that. And we do that because you start with that screening data that you have, and it's going to customize the learning for every single student. So they're going to work on exactly what it is they need to work on, right? They're not going to work on extra things. They're going to work exactly where their gaps are in that teachable order. Obviously, we really believe in the unit structure of Classworks, the concept of that direct instruction, then the variety of activities and games to apply knowledge, and then finally ending with that formative check, really believing that when a student masters a skill inside of Classworks, they're mastering it for life. They're not just mastering it to pass a high-stakes test or to pass a unit quiz. Some other options inside of Classworks when we think about the DBI process are modifying what you might do. So if you've got a student working in their learning progression, you might decide, I'm actually going to pull them off the learning progression and create some custom instruction for them because, in fact, they're not responding and they really need some targeted skills to work on before they return to the learning progression. Or you might decide for a little while, I'm going to print some reading passages for students to work on and have them do some work paper and pencil as opposed to working in that learning progression. You might decide to do the same thing with math, have them work on the math problem-solving activities at those various DOK levels to help them really refocus on their learning. And all of these are some of the adaptations that you might make to the validated intervention when you're working with your students. So the next piece of this, like we mentioned, is the progress monitoring. So you want to have formal progress monitoring. We all talk a lot about monitoring progress, unit scores, maybe specific skills that we've got students working on. But what we need to do at the DBI process is we need to do valid and reliable progress monitoring, which is a little bit different than I think what we have in a lot of our heads about what progress monitoring is. Right? So here are some common misconceptions about progress monitoring. You don't want to use the scores from your intervention programs as progress measures. We struggle with this at Classworks. I'm sure you've talked to some districts that say, well, they bring in their scores from the progression to show maybe that they need a referral if these are students that are receiving Tier 3 services. And really the data from Classworks that you want to be using is the progress monitoring data, not the data from the intervention. And of course, we hear this other programs as well. They go, yeah, we're using Lexia or MobiMax. And really, that's more diagnostic data when you see a student isn't responding to their progress monitoring. It's not valid and reliable progress monitoring. You can't use teacher-created probes as progress measures. I mean, not only is that really hard when students move from school to school, but no matter how well written a teacher progress monitoring is, it's never been validated, right? There's no mechanism to make something valid and reliable that was teacher-created and then teacher-administered. And the other one that fits into that is using running records as progress monitoring. And that's simply because a teacher is selecting the passage in the running record. So as soon as the teacher is inserted into the process, we lose that validity and reliability for it. Now, it's not to say that teacher-created probes don't give us good skill-specific information, and running records don't give us a kind of eyeballs on students' reading fluency. It's just not what you're going to want to use for your valid and reliable progress monitoring. So Classworks progress monitoring is valid and reliable, and these are all on the NCII tools chart for progress monitoring. It is curriculum independent. So it says, regardless of what your interventions are for the student, over here, this separate measure shows whether or not growth is happening, right? And that's kind of the important piece of it, is to keep the two separated. It allows you to monitor progress over time. It has those 20 parallel forms for weekly use. And then obviously it has that automatic graphing that's such a time saver for folks, as I'm sure you guys know. And in all the meetings that I've been in recently, this is what teachers love, because sometimes progress monitoring is just a little bit labor intensive, isn't it? So then this is the report that's created. This is a perfect report to use with student support team meetings, to send home to parents every 9 weeks for students with IEPs. Not only does it show all the graphing that you need automatically, it also shows any notes teachers made And then it even has a section at the end of it, as I'm sure you guys know, that will show scores in the intervention itself. So now we've started our validated intervention program. We've got students working in their learning progression. We have started separately the exact right progress monitoring for students to work on that's independent from the intervention program. Next, we go, okay, it's been 4 weeks. Which of my students are not responding? Okay, I've got 4 of them. Now I have to gather diagnostic data to figure out why aren't they responding? So later we're going to look at 4 students and we're going to really dig into specifically what kind of data we gather, right, about that student to understand what kind of adjustments that we might want to make for their intervention. So a lot of times you're going to want to use the Classworks scores as the diagnostic data, right? That's going to be in addition to classroom samples. It could be high stakes test scores. It could be observations from teachers. It could be behavior, attendance, all different things that you're going to look at to go, why aren't we seeing what we want to see on that progress monitoring chart? What's happening with that student, right? Then once you've gathered all that information and talked to all the right people, what you're going to do is you're going to go ahead and say, okay, I need to make an adaptation to this student's intervention. And again, I don't want to do something huge to make a change for that student, right? I really want to say, what's one small thing that I can do to change up how the student is engaging with the validated intervention program that we've selected. So these are the most popular Classworks adaptations. This is what we train on. And we're going to spend some time in these tomorrow, really talking about how and when you might, right? So you might assign some preset science of reading or early numeracy assignments that the students see right alongside the learning progression. You might decide to increase the student time in the intervention, right? What their dosage is, because you see that they're responding, but you might want to make sure they have enough opportunity to really work in the units. You might go ahead and create those custom assignments that I showed you briefly earlier. You can create those by standard or by skill based on something specific that you observe the student really needs to work on prior to returning to their learning progression. You might be as simple as deciding, I'm looking at this learning path and I'm just going to turn off and on a couple things that I think will help them maximize their time in the learning progression. You might decide to assign Classworks printable lessons, right? To help them maybe do some work paper and pencil and maybe intersperse the computer with that. Or you might decide to set SMART goals with them, right? If they're saying, we're having trouble staying focused, we want to set some goals around some behavior to help them stay focused. And then most importantly, throughout this, you don't ever want to stop the progress monitoring, right? Because what we're hoping to see is, okay, I have my 25 kids, 21 of them are doing great. These 4 that weren't, I'm going to make a change. And what I'm hoping to see is a graph that was doing this. Now, based on my small change, is going to start to do this. Right? And that's really the goal that you have, because your progress monitoring is that independent measure that says, is everything I'm doing over here in the intervention world, does an independent measure say, yes, this is working, right? That's why it's so important to keep the 2 separate, right? And that's probably why you guys have invested in Classworks, because it's one login, one platform, but it gives you both of those things under that one platform separately. So then, of course, like I just said, we're still going to use all of this data to see what we hope to see, which is that student responding once we make that modification. Now, NCII recommends you look at that data again in about 6 weeks. We really coach districts to stay on that 4-week schedule to hope to see the impact of that change, right? So that's really the goal that you're going to have as you step through that whole DBI process. So I don't think that, I'm going to pop back over to the whole process again. I just want to recap it really quickly. So again, it starts with that validated intervention program. You guys are using Classworks. You probably took our screener to individualize that instruction for every student. Then you separately started the right progress monitoring tool for the student. And remember that universal screener recommends the level of progress monitoring that you would have the student work on. Then after 4 weeks, when those students weren't responding, hopefully only 4 of them or so, if you do have more students not responding, you want to step back and make sure that you're implementing your intervention program with fidelity, right? You want to make sure that you're using the program the amount of time, that you're reassigning units if students aren't passing them, right? And that you kids are coached on always doing their best in progress monitoring, right? Sometimes those are easy fixes that can help you get the results that you want without needing to go through the whole DBI process with all your students, right? But you will have those few that really aren't responding, and you do need to make some changes. So that's where you go talk to folks, gather your diagnostic data to develop a hypothesis about maybe what is it you need to change. Then you make that adaptation to the intervention, right? And then all along the way, you want to make sure you continue progress monitoring every step of the way. So that's really kind of just the overview. Like I said, the next session goes into using Classworks as the intervention program. Then Joanne's going to cover progress monitoring. Then tomorrow, we're actually going to go through and do a case study with 4 students, gather their data, decide what modifications we're going to make. And that should be pretty fun. And then decide as a group what the best adaptation should be to their intervention. So yeah, so we're pretty excited just to give you that brief overview.